Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from the world. Welcome to another webinar hosted by Thinc, the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation. On today's session, we will look at the role of the United Nations and some of its different bodies, and what is the role they play in the context before and during the current Hamas-Israel war. As some of you may probably know already, Thinc is a global network of international law academics, practitioners, and experts in related disciplines. It was founded in 2017 in The Hague, the global capital of international law. We challenge the misuse of international law to delegitimize the state of Israel and advocate international law for peace and security between Israel and her neighbors. International law is a major weapon used by Israel's adversaries, and misuse of it is an existential threat to the Jewish state. We achieve our mission through research, education, and advocacy. Thank you for joining us today. In our panel today, we have three honored guests. Dr. Einat Wilf. She is a leading thinker in Israel, Zionism, foreign policy, and education. She was a member of the Israeli parliament from 2010 to 2013. Where she served as a chair of the Education Committee and member of the influential Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. She was born and raised in Israel. Dr. Wilf served as an intelligence officer in the Israel Defense Forces in the IDF. She was in the foreign policy advisor to Vice Prime Minister Shimon Peres and a strategic consultant with McKinsey and Company. As well, we have Dr. Mattijs de Blois. He's a senior fellow together with us at Thinc. His academic focus is in the philosophical and historical aspects of the law, specifically the relationship between law and religion. He's a Dutch legal academic specialized in international law and European law. Dr. de Blois lectures and writes frequently about the position of the State of Israel on international law, which has become the main focus of his research within the framework of Thinc, and he's the co-author of Israel on Trial. And last but not least, as a moderator, we have today Advocate Andrew Tucker, who's the Director General of Thinc. Welcome, everybody. Hello, Andrew. Let's begin.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. Well, welcome, everybody. It's awesome to have you again with us. We have a great topic ahead of us, I think a very, very important one and much too big for one webinar. It's the question of the United Nations, its role in relation to this conflict. Many of us may not be aware what a significant role the United Nations plays, how the United Nations works, what is it actually, what does it do, what does it say? And we're going to dig into those issues. Of course, we don't take criticism of the United Nations lightly. We're not seeking here to condemn the United Nations, but we do feel it's important to see clearly the reality that is in front of us and the biases, the prejudices that tend to be within the UN system when it comes to the Jewish people. One senses that since the 7th of October, we're in a kind of a new time, a new period of world history, perhaps. We've moved into something largely unknown. No longer do Western nations control international affairs. Russia and China, both Security Council members, have shown in recent years they are hostile to Western interests. Iran is presenting an existential threat to the region and beyond. The European Union has become largely irrelevant. Russia is gaining the upper hand in the Ukraine potentially and remains highly active and influential in the Middle East. Syria remains divided. Assad is still in power. The position of Turkey is not to be underestimated. These are just some of the elements that are ahead of us. On the other hand, we've witnessed some emerging new alliances on the international stage, bridging cultural and religious gulfs, such as the Abraham Accords and the development, at least before the 7th of October, of a transportation infrastructure potentially connecting India to Europe via Saudi Arabia and Israel. Now, all of this potentially plays into this conflict with Hamas, which, as we know, is not operating independently. It's highly interconnected with Iran, with Qatar, who are financing, militarizing Hamas, and potentially have been involved in instigating the attacks of the 7th of October, which were very well prepared over many years. And Israel is now trying to deal with an extremely complex situation of 240 hostages. Some have been released, thankfully, but many are still in captivity. We don't know if they're all alive. We don't know where they are. And Hamas is still largely in control of the southern part of the Gaza Strip. So the UN from day one, I think even from the very first moment of the conflict, raised some question marks. Even on the 9th of October, a minute of silence was held in the Security Council for the Palestinian victims of this conflict. The UN Women has failed to speak out on behalf of Israeli women who are being captured, and not only captured, raped, mutilated, many of them terribly, terribly mistreated. The UN Women has not spoken out on their behalf. I'm just mentioning a few examples here. The Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights has just come out a few days ago, or 12 days ago actually, with a statement on behalf of UN experts to say that grave violations are being committed by Israel against the Palestinians, pointing to a genocide in the making, according to the United Nations. So little about Hamas, little about the atrocities committed by Hamas, little about the hostages. Before I move to our speakers, let's just remind ourselves that Israel was created in 1948, not by the United Nations. I think Israel came into existence despite the United Nations, which was created in 1945, so 3 years before the creation of the State of Israel. It basically succeeded the League of Nations, and has always kind of considered itself to be seized of the Palestinian problem. This is perhaps the last remaining problem of colonization which the UN feels it has to solve. So the Palestinian agenda has been first and foremost on the UN agenda, and especially since the 1970s. I think if we go back to the early mid-1970s, so we're talking the period after the Yom Kippur War, which potentially was a major turning point in history, when the Arab nations turned to the United Nations to destroy Israel, having failed to do so militarily on the battlefield. They sought refuge in the UN. The Palestine Liberation Organization was embraced in 1974. Yasser Arafat, we all know the images, don't we, of him appearing on the UN platform with a revolver on one side and a olive branch on the other. The message was clear. If you don't give us what we want, we will use violence. And ever since then, we've seen a raft of Palestinian entities, organizations, organs, institutions created within the UN system to advance the Palestinian agenda. One of them, the most important potentially, the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, a major institution within the UN. Mandated by the General Assembly to push the Palestinian agenda. We have the other organizations that were created by the United Nations General Assembly all around this period of 1974, 1975, the Special Unit on Palestinian Rights created in 1977, which was morphed into the Division for Palestinian Rights, embedded within the UN. The Secretary General is advised and informed by all of these institutions. There is no institution representing Israel or the Jewish people. So currently we have proceedings at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. And if you see the evidence and the information that is being given to the court, it's all being pushed by one side of the agenda, which is not to say that agenda should not be pushed, but there seems to be an inherent imbalance or bias within the system. We want to make a bridge and a link to what is going on today. And to do that, we're just going to look at a very short interview with a Hamas leader who talks about the role of the United Nations.
البعض يتساءل، وهذا سؤال رائج وشائع، يعني من قام بتشييد 500 كيلومتر من الأنفاق، لماذا لم يشيد مآوي يلجأ إليها المدنيون خلال القصف؟
من الأنفاق. أما القطاع غزة فأنت تعلم والجميع يعلم بأنه 75% منه لاجئين.
So I don't think we can hear this, but you can see quite clearly from the text what is going on here, talking about the tunnels in Gaza, which have been built by Hamas, and the civilian population of Gaza is being prevented from access to those tunnels. This is a few weeks ago. So, of course, creating a huge humanitarian issue within the Gaza Strip. It talks about why they do not allow access to the tunnels. So according to Hamas, the responsibility for protecting the civilians in Gaza Strip lies on both Israel and the United Nations, not on Hamas, which is apparently, which was elected as the government of the Gaza Strip, but they refused to accept responsibility for their civilians. So Dr. Einat Wilf, I'd like to turn to you. Why is it that Hamas considers that the United Nations is responsible for the civilians of Gaza, and what is the UN doing about it?
So Hamas is channeling a very permanent and old Palestinian idea that basically the United Nations is responsible for their plight. And that's a very old idea, and we see it come up again and again. So in that sense, Hamas is not inventing anything new. In the Palestinian telling of things, basically the United Nations created Israel. And we're on the eve of November 29th, the day that the United Nations General Assembly voted in 1947 for partition of the British Mandate area into two states, a Jewish and an Arab. And I have a colleague, Shani Moore, who wrote a beautiful piece recently called Ecstasy and Amnesia, in which he highlighted that in 1947, 67, 2000, and now, the Palestinian attitude is characterized initially by annihilationist ecstasy. We saw it on October 7th. They go to war, they declare they're very open about their declarations, their intent to butcher Jews, to destroy Israel, for there not to be a Jewish state. But then when they lose, amnesia sets in, all memory of their intent, of their responsibility disappears. So the theme that Palestinians are never responsible for the consequences of their choices and actions is also a very permanent theme. So amnesia sets in, there's no responsibility, and all that emerges is a story of pure victimhood. And we're seeing it in real time, happens from October 7th, the ecstasy, the annihilationist rhetoric, and then now into this rhetoric of pure victimhood and a complete denial and forgetfulness of their responsibility, their choices, their actions. So in the same way, they completely forget the annihilationist rhetoric that preceded 1947 as they went to war, basically saying the Jews, the rejection of partition was not because they didn't agree on this or that border. The rejection was the Jews should not have a state anywhere, period. Any Jewish state in any border under any kind of territory is just simply unacceptable and illegitimate. Arabs described it as something that they could not accept and that they would have to go to war. That it would be humiliating for them not to go to war. They would have to use violence to destroy any chance of a Jewish state. They failed. The Jewish state emerged in a very, very difficult and existential battle. As soon as the state of Israel gains independence, they basically, again, amnesia sets in, and they had nothing to do with it. They reject any responsibility for rejecting partition. You're going to see it tomorrow as they mark November 29th. Complete forgetfulness about their decisions, the consequences. So one of the ways that this pure victimhood narrative emerges in 47, 48 is basically saying the UN is responsible. The United Nations is responsible. We had nothing to do with it. We are pure victims of the mendacity of the United Nations daring to pass a recommendation. It's not even a real resolution, a recommendation that basically says that the Arabs and the Jews should have a state. They forget that they said no to the Arab state. And the only evil thing that remains is that the UN dared support a Jewish state. And that's the story. That's been the story for every Palestinian organization, for the Palestinian people as a whole. Hamas is not special in that. The idea that Palestinians, those who butcher Jews should basically, they're the ones who are leading the battle against the Jewish state, and anything else is just not their responsibility. Any notion of connection between actions and consequences, responsibility is entirely lost on them.
So when you look at the UN kind of narrative, well, as far as at least they've adopted the Palestinian narrative, it goes back, doesn't it, to actually the whole idea of the whole Balfour Declaration and the mandate was in self inherently illegitimate because this was creating an entity on Arab land. So it even goes back before 47, doesn't it? That they go right back to the very beginning. Even the Palestinian Charter, I think, the PLO's own charter, still talks in this way, doesn't it?
Oh, certainly. Here again, a complete denial, forgetfulness that they got countries too. I mean, as I'm sure you know, pretty much the 20th century is marked by the disappearance of empires and the rise of states to replace those empires. The reason that the League of Nations even got involved is because when the Ottoman Empire was disbanded, basically, the British and the French wanted to keep it as imperial lands, and the Americans said, no, we're entering a new era of self-determination for peoples. So the compromise was, you know what? The people of Europe can have self-determination, but the people of the Ottoman Empire, they're not really ready for it. So the Arabs, the Jews, the Turks, the Armenians, the Kurds, you know, they should all have their state, but especially the Jews and the Arabs, they need tutors, right? They need people to help them along. Those are going to be the French and the British. The Turks did what they did to the Armenians, to the Kurds. As a result, there was no Kurdistan, no Armenia. Turkey became twice its size. The Arabs tried to do the same with the Jews, but they failed. But the idea was that the Jews are a people of the Ottoman Empire. I always mention that if the Jews received their fair share of the land of the Ottoman Empire based on their share of the population, Israel would have been multiple times the size. So, and the idea was, the Jews get a state, the Arabs get a state. So again, the Arabs got their states, Iraq, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, but they pocketed them. But the idea that the Jews should get a state on the lands of the Ottoman Empire, it wasn't Arab land. It didn't belong to anyone. It was the lands of the Ottoman Empire, and it belonged to the peoples of the Ottoman Empire, of which the Jews were one. But yes, you're absolutely right. They tell themselves a story that some imperial body came from the outside, gave their land to these outside interlopers, when it's exactly the opposite. Everyone acknowledged the historical Jewish connection between the Jewish people and Judea, between the people of Israel and the land of Israel. In the early 20th century, the Arabs recognized this connection. They've just spent the next century denying it. It was recognized. It was obvious. No one debated that the Jews are connected to the land of Israel, that once they want to be a sovereign people, this is the appropriate land. And it was not given to them. It was considered theirs, that once the empire is gone, those are the people that have at least the right to some of the land. But of course, the British and the French fulfilled their mandates to the Arabs. That's why Jordan, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon all gained their independence during this time. But the one people that do not gain their independence, and we need to remember they do not gain their independence at the most critical time in Jewish history. The state of Israel could have already existed in the 1930s if it were not for Arab violence and the British caving into Arab violence. So only because the British did not fulfill their promise to the Jewish people, the question goes back to the United Nations, which is the heir of the League of Nations. But you're absolutely right that Palestinians take it all the way back, that there was a complete denial and rejection both of the process of the imperial decline and replacement by Arab states, and the fact that the Jews were a people with a legitimate claim to a state in part of the Ottoman imperial lands.
So, I mean, if you look at Syria and Iraq and Jordan, they were all created around the same time, weren't they? And all as a result of the same system of mandates. So why did the UN suddenly become so obsessed with the Palestinian cause and not with the Kurds or the Armenians or the Syriacs or the Baluch or any other people group? How do we explain this?
So the short answer is, of course, because it's the Jews. I mean, the obsession, the Arab rejection, the Arab refusal to allow a Jewish state has deep theological underpinnings. The notion from the Arab perspective that the lowly Jews cannot be allowed to be their equal as a people, as a nation, that's an unacceptable idea. And they ultimately forced the United Nations to accept that idea. So sometimes I joke that for a singular moment in 1948, the United Nations General Assembly voted to give support and legitimacy to the establishment of a Jewish state, and they've spent all subsequent years trying to undo that. So we see it immediately happening already in 48, 49. There are already efforts when the Palestinians are the only people basically throughout this period, throughout geography, who are given an exception. All other peoples throughout this time, I mean, there's world wars, regional wars, civil wars, tens of millions of people are displaced by the empires disappearing and new states being created, new borders being delineated, people flee across borders to be on the side, typically that is more ethnically similar to them. And the message to all these tens of millions of refugees is, it's tragic, it's tough, but this is it. You move on. I mean, there's no going back in the most fundamental sense. There's no going back physically, and there's no going back in time. This is the new reality. Those are the new states. These are the new borders, and that's it. Everybody moves on, except one exception, which is the Arab refugees, later to be known as Palestinians. And the only reason that the Arabs are made into an exception into what becomes this perpetual refugee situation which basically creates an always existing question mark over the existence of the state of Israel. So we need to understand that from the UN perspective, in 47, 48, they kind of gave legitimacy to a Jewish state. And from that moment on, they made sure to put a question mark on it.
Okay, well, so we're going to come back to the refugees because I want to dig into
Sure.
that. But first, Dr. Du Blois. So where was the UN in the War of Independence in 48? Where was the UN in the Six-Day War? Where was the UN in the Yom Kippur War? Did we see them playing a constructive role in solving these conflicts?
I'm afraid not. The War of Independence, Israel, the newborn state of Israel, was attacked by 5 Arab states. And the Organization in the World for Peace and Security did not interfere to the extent that the Arab states were stopped in their objectives. And it was up to the young state of Israel to defend itself to a high cost of people who died in that war. And well, the same is true if we go through history. Also in 1967, the Six-Day War. Indeed, Israel was attacked again by Arab states with an objective to erase it from the earth. And well, thank God it was not successful, that war, but Israel came out victorious, and many parts of the original mandate territory came under Israeli control, and like Judea Samaria, which was created was named the West Bank by the Jordanians, who had occupied it before that, and the Gaza Strip, and well, that brings us also to the present situation. But
so I mean, I get the impression, if you look at the period, that sort of from 48 right up to 73, the UN was kind of fixed on this idea of partition, right? Even though the partition plan had been rejected, as Dr. Wilf has told us, by the Arabs, the UN has it in their mind that the land still west of the Jordan has to be partitioned in some way. And it's become the 67 lines, or the 1949 armistice lines, which have become the border. You've written this book, Israel on Trial, which is about really the history of how Israel is on trial within the United Nations.
Yes.
How would you describe that period of the UN's role, say from 48 until 73?
Well, yes, it did not. It is, of course, the UN is the main institution in the world, so to say, for the protection of peace and security. The ideals were very high lifted in the beginning of, and there was a kind of expectation, or at least aspiration, that this body could create peace and security and protect and recognize the right of self-determination, also of the Jewish people, of course, which was indeed already recognized in the mandate under the League of Nations. But I think you see in the development within the United Nations, there is a kind of permanent factor, which is the kind of bias against the state of Israel.
Why is it the UN thinks it has the right to determine Israel's borders when it doesn't question the borders of any other state in the region?
Yes.
Does the UN have any power to determine where the borders of the state of Israel lie?
Not at all. Not at all. I think that is also not in the Charter of the UN. There is no authority for either the Security Council or the General Assembly to determine borders. What is a principle of the UN is the self-determination, and that was already embodied in the original mandate system. And in the Charter of the UN, Article 80, it is said that the rights of peoples under the mandate system should be preserved, including the rights of the Jewish people to the whole territory of the mandate, which extends from, we cannot almost not use this expression, from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea.
Okay, well, let's take that as a bridge back to our situation today, because we have people demonstrating in the streets of London, New York, Sydney,
Yes.
everywhere else, calling for the liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea. Dr. Wilf, I want you to talk us through this question of the refugees, because I think this is critical to understanding. What is the refugee system? How did it come into existence? And what role is it playing in this conflict?
Certainly. The short answer is that the whole perpetuation of the Palestinians as an ever-permanent refugees, possessing a fictional right of return into sovereign state of Israel, is the mechanism by which the Arabs were hoping to keep the war of 1948 alive. So that's the short answer, a bit of an expansion. As I said, throughout the 20th century, empires break, new states are established, tens of millions of people flee across borders, sometimes are brutally displaced, ethnically cleansed. The Germans, you have Poles and Ukrainians and Greeks and Turks and Hindus and Muslims. And again, the message to all of them is you don't look back, you move forward. It's tragic, it's tough, you lost your home. But if everyone would look back, it would be endless war. So we are moving forward based on the principle of self-determination for these new states that replace the imperial lands. One exception is made in the case of the Arab refugees from the land. Now, the exception is not immediate. The idea is actually to settle the Arab refugees. One of the best ways to compare UNRWA, the agency, the temporary, still temporary agency that is established to settle the Arab refugees, it's important to mention about a quarter of the Jews are also displaced, but Israel just absorbs them, no question. I'm not talking even yet about Jews from Arab countries, just the Jews in the West Bank and Gaza. They were ethnically cleansed, they were displaced. Israel absorbs them, that's it.
Hang on, just when did this happen?
Oh, throughout the war, 47, 48, 49. In the course of war, the Ottoman Empire is gone, the British Mandate is gone, and basically because the Arabs reject partition, rather than declare independence and have an Arab state next to the Jewish state, they go to war. And in war, people become refugees. That's always what wars are like. And the Jewish refugees at the end of the war are fully absorbed by Israel. And the idea is that the Arab refugees will be absorbed by Jordan, that basically annexed the West Bank, Gaza, and Egypt, which occupied the Gaza Strip, Syria, Lebanon. Now, the best way to explain the story of the Arab refugees is to look at the Korean refugees. At about the same time as the Arab refugees, you have the Korean War. A temporary agency is established for them called UNRWA. Why temporary? Because at this time, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the new agency established for refugees by the United Nations, the actual agency, is mostly focused on Europe. The devastation in Europe is massive. So in Korea and in the Middle East, they established temporary agencies with the idea of, okay, they're going to take 3-4 years. We're going to give them a budget. Everyone will be resettled and the agency closes. And that's exactly what happened in Korea. 2 million refugees, 3 times the number of the Arabs, are all settled within 3 to 4 years with a third of the budget of UNRWA, and the agency closes. And look at South Korea today, right? It could have been the Palestinians. But again, we get to the thing, because it's Jews, the Arab refugees themselves, not just the Arab host countries, reject any notion of resettlement, because they know that the moment that the Arab refugees are resettled is the moment that the war ends, basically. And they don't want the war to end. From their perspective, yes, Israel was able to declare independence, but they're not going to accept it. It doesn't mean that the war against the Jewish state is over. And like it was mentioned here, this is why Israel emerges without any borders. People always use the term the pre-1967 borders. Pre-1967, Israel doesn't have borders. because none of its neighbors are willing to recognize these lines. Those are armistice lines, ceasefire lines in an ongoing war. So one of the ways of putting a question mark on Israel's existence, one of them is to refuse to make peace with it, only have ceasefire lines, right? The first in a long history of ceasefires that are intended to just keep the war going. And another means of keeping the war going is the complete rejection and refusal of the resettlement of the Arab refugees. And UNRWA basically, as a temporary agency, is never closed because the Arabs and the Palestinians themselves ultimately hijack the agency, making it into a Palestinian organization, in order to say, look, this war is not over until we say it's over. And we are only going to say that this war is over when the Jewish state no longer exists. And until then, we're going to be generation after generation registered refugees, no refugees by any international standards, but by refugees only by Palestinian standards. And we're going to teach generation after generation that they have one singular duty, which is to liberate Palestine from the river to the sea, from the existence of a Jewish state. And that's where Hamas comes from. Hamas is not something special.
So are you saying that UNRWA, the UN refugee system for the Palestinians, rejects the right of existence of the state of Israel?
In effect, of course. Because if your entire organization was basically designed to put a question mark on the existence of another state, then that's what it is. Nowhere else is it acceptable to keep alive the idea that the war is not over, that it could still be won to your side. I mean, one of the impressive things about the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, again, the actual UN agency for refugees, is that it never asks question of who started it, who's just, what, basically in the first couple of years after a conflict, of course, they try to get refugees to go home. But if that's not possible, they don't care why and who started and who's responsible. They basically say, okay, let's move on. The spirit is always let's move on, let's move forward. Let's make sure you can settle in this new country or maybe in a third country. But the idea is that within a few years, people are supposed to no longer be refugees. And this is, by the way, why the Arab states insisted that when the UNHCR was established, that UNRWA will get a loophole. So this whole talk is under the headline of international law. International law is only valuable if it's the same for everyone, right? International law is useless if you create a loophole that says when it has to do with the Jewish state, we're going to have very different rules than we're going to have for all the other states. Then it's not international law. It's just a bunch of lies that people can speak self-importantly about, but it's not properly international law because it's not uniform across different situations.
So a lot of people think, the people of Gaza, the paradigm is it's an oppressed people under an occupation. So they have a right of resistance to object to this oppressive occupation, which is preventing them from having probably a Palestinian state together with their brothers and sisters in the West Bank. And yet, at the same time, we're seeing their refugees who are being held out with this idea they're not only going to get a state of their own next to Israel, they're going to get the right to return to Israel and replace the state of Israel. Would that be a fair assessment of the situation?
Even worse, the reason that Palestinians don't have a state is not because of Israeli occupation or Israeli actions. The reason they don't have a state is that in every juncture, from 1937 to the present, you can even go back, at every juncture when they faced a choice, you can have your own state, but the Jews will also have their state next to you. Their choice was to say, that's not acceptable. So there was never a moment when the Palestinian people actually said, we care more about having a state for ourselves rather than ensuring that the Jews don't have a state. Unfortunately, the Palestinians have been built as a people, and especially they coalesced in the UNRWA education system, as a people who are singularly focused on the idea that their most noble duty is to destroy the Jewish state. You know, a lot of people said recently, what was Hamas trying to achieve with this butchery? And then a lot of people said, oh, they were able to bring the Palestinian cause back to international attention after it was in danger of being sidelined with normalization with Saudi. Well, that rang a bell because one of the planners of the 1972 massacre of the Israeli athletes in the Munich Olympics said the same thing. He said, I'm very proud of what we did. I'm never sorry for it because it put the Palestinian cause on the global attention. Great. So in 1972, they put the Palestinian cause on the global attention. And what do they have to show for it? Nothing. And the reason they have nothing to show for it is because their cause was never about building something for themselves. It was always about destroying something for someone else. If that's your cause, it's going to be harder to achieve it. If your cause is to build, then you build. But if your cause is to destroy for someone else, yes, you can put it on the global attention, but ultimately you're probably not going to achieve it.
Okay, so thank you. Dr. Du Blois, let's just move towards the UN resolutions which were passed recently. Since the 7th of October, I think the Security Council has met many times to consider the conflict and never come to a resolution until very recently. The General Assembly has passed several resolutions. You've been writing about this. You've been analyzing these resolutions. What do you make of them?
Yes.
What do they say first, and what do you make of them?
Well, first of all, it is, of course, to say the least, surprising that the Security Council did not come up with a resolution directly after the pogrom, the atrocities in Israel on the 7th of October, where so many people were murdered and raped and mutilated and kidnapped. And there has been an emergency meeting on the 8th of October of the Security Council, but it did not succeed in adopting a resolution at that date. If you compare it to the 9/11 terrorist attacks on the US in 2001, the day after 9/11, the Security Council adopted a resolution condemning the terrorist act against the US. So, but the Security Council did not succeed in adopting a resolution. There have been many proposals over the weeks, and several attempts were made, but unsuccessful. So by the end of October, the General Assembly stepped in using the Uniting for Peace mechanism. That is a mechanism developed in the early 1950s, where if the Security Council is not able to exercise its primary responsibility in the field of peace and security, in a sense, the General Assembly takes over. And that led to a resolution adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations on the 27th of October. A resolution adopted during the so-called special emergency session of the General Assembly, which lasts since 1997. But in this resolution, there are remarkable things. Well, this resolution is called for a humanitarian truce leading to a cessation of hostilities. Very neutral expression. And what is striking in this resolution of the General Assembly, there is no condemnation whatsoever of Hamas, who initiated this massacre in Israel. There's no condemnation of Hamas. If we look at other resolutions adopted by the General Assembly in the year before, there was an immediate condemnation of Russia for the aggression against Ukraine, but not in this resolution. It is surprisingly what is said in this resolution of the General Assembly. It is condemning, yes, all acts of violence, and I quote, aimed at Palestinian and Israeli civilians, suggesting that Palestinians were the first victims and then afterwards the Israelis, suggesting that it was Israel that started the violence and the hostilities rather than Hamas and its cronies. So that is a kind of false way of thinking. And
because I think you see this a lot more often now, don't you? There's
yes,
an increasing perception that actually Israel is the aggressor here.
yes.
And people also, they reinvent the Six-Day War. Israel was perceived to be the aggressor there. How do we meet that? Or how do you meet that claim, that challenge, that, or how do you support the view that Hamas is the aggressor and Israel is defending itself when Israel is vastly more powerful than Hamas? And how does law help us understand that distinction?
Well, of course, if we look at the facts, what happened on the 7th of October, there was a brutal action not provoked by Israel. There was not kind of act of war by Israel that led to a kind of self-defense by Hamas, but the other way around. There was a brutal attack, not on military, just on civilians living in Israel, even in the part of Israel which is, so to say, in the international community, undisputed. It was in the Negev desert. And, well, we know what happened. Civilians were killed, babies and elderly people and adults and so on and so forth. People were kidnapped and abducted, and up until this very day, many people are still hostages. So it is incredible that the General Assembly and 121 members of the world community, states, have adopted this resolution. And it's also striking, for example, what they say in the resolution also, that they call for the, and I quote, the immediate and unconditional release of all civilians who are being illegally held captive, as if civilians from both sides were held captive in this conflict. It was exclusively Hamas that kidnapped Israeli citizens and of all ages. And so again, they suggest there are two parties quarreling and they both have responsibility for it.
So, Dr. Wilf, the Secretary General made a comment at a certain point, didn't he? He said, look, this attack didn't occur in a vacuum, suggesting that somehow Israel was responsible for the attack, which I think a lot of people rejected. The Israeli ambassador to the UN called for the resignation of the Secretary General. And he said, I'm going to wear a yellow star from here on in because this is just further sign of the demonization of the Jewish people. Is that an example, do you think, of this kind of idea that Israel somehow is illegitimately claiming some rights to the Gaza Strip?
First of all, I use sometimes this phrase that in the United Nations, the nations are only united when it comes to Israel. And this is definitely the dynamic that you see, especially in the beginning in the late 60s, 70s, when the Soviet Union really uses a lot of the new rising nations to create an entire political organization in the United Nations by focusing on the Palestinians, which, again, we have to admit, the only reason anyone ever cared about the Palestinians was because they fought the Jews. Otherwise, any other conflict, you can definitely see it in the UN. Nobody cares. The UN Secretary General said a few days later, he said, the devastation in Gaza, the number of deaths, it's the worst he's ever seen in his time as Secretary General. Now, why would anyone make a comment that's so easy to check? Because within minutes of him making that comment, Twitter was filled with people like, this happened to the Tigrays in Ethiopia, this happened in Congo, this happened in Afghanistan, this. But it actually shows you something deep. When it's not about the Jewish state and the Palestinians, somehow it doesn't get noticed. And this is the corruption of the UN. At the end of the day, whenever bodies, organizations, countries become obsessed with Jews in one way, shape, or another, they get corrupted. They collapse into themselves. And the United Nations that was established with so much idealism and fanfare, and still for many people represents the ideals of a better world, has been corrupted by the single-minded obsession. And you spoke about the various bodies that all were created by the Zionism as racism resolution. The resolution was repealed in the 90s. The bodies that it created continue to operate and corrupt the UN and its mission on a daily basis. So definitely when the Secretary General said those words, and I've been using it ever since, he's right. October 7th did not happen in vacuum. It's just that he's not aware, or maybe he is, but ignores it, of the role of the UN in essentially creating the environment that created Hamas through UNRWA, through the demonization of Israel and giving legitimacy to the idea that the Jewish state is uniquely evil, through what was mentioned here, always imposing ceasefires. Never, Israel is the one country where when it wins, immediately there's a demand for a ceasefire. In other countries, other conflicts, there's always an understanding that whatever the final agreement is, when the conflict is over, the victor, it goes more in the direction of the victor. Again, except with Israel, it's about a long history of always calling for ceasefires. The UN is one of the major organizations that has contributed to the ability of an organization like Hamas to carry out October 7th. So he's right, it didn't happen in a vacuum. It's just that he happens to preside over the organization that created that environment.
Thank you so much. So we're going to turn to some questions which are coming in, are very good questions. I mean, there's a bit of a dilemma, really, isn't there, when it comes to Gaza? Because Israel, on the one hand, says, well, we don't want to be in Gaza. We don't want Gaza. We left in 2005, right? We pulled out. We forced 8,000 Israeli citizens against their will to move. And yet it's having to conquer, it's having to go in, it's making a big mess in Gaza Strip. Let's face it, thousands of people are being killed. The place is becoming a horrible scene of destruction. What's going to happen going forward? And can the UN play a constructive role in this? And I just want a very quick answer because we don't have a lot of time, but what hope is there going forward?
So I'll just say we're facing all terrible choices. They're all awful. We actually don't have a good choice at this moment. The one that I favor is the one that basically essentially re-educates Palestinians away from the destructive cause of from the river to the sea towards a constructive vision of peace and living next to the Jewish state rather than instead of it. It means dismantling all the UN support for that, dismantling UNRWA, dismantling all the idea of support for from the river to the sea. That is a crucial element in getting the Palestinians to develop a positive vision rather than the negative one that they've had essentially their entire existence.
Thank you. Dr. Blois, what's your perspective here?
Well, I think I agree, Dr. Wilf, that I think there is the role of the UN shall not be impressive in this way. It has shown over the years, over the decades, that it is biased, that it is not an impartial institution, that it treats Israel in a way different from the way it treats all countries in the world. Just count the number of resolutions adopted against Israel. Every ordinary General Assembly session, it is always the resolutions against Israel always outnumber by far the resolutions adopted against the whole rest of the world, with dictatorships like North Korea and China and whatever countries we have, Iran. So I think we should not expect too much, or maybe nothing, from the United Nations. It is illustrated also with what you quoted from the Secretary General and what we see in the resolutions adopted recently by the General Assembly and also by the Security Council. So it's maybe, yes, on a level just between Israel and representatives of the Palestinian people you can trust, and that is also a difficulty, I think. Who will...
So there's going to be there's going to have to be a solution of this refugee system, because you can't keep people generation after generation. So, and if there's not going to be a Palestinian state, the question is what? So this is a great topic for the next webinar, I think. Mm-hmm. We're going to turn to some questions coming in. Sylvia, would you help us navigate through? I see some excellent questions in the chat, but I'm sure there are others. Would you?
Sure. So I'll merge some of them. So, for example, why is Jordan or other countries not open to more Palestinian refugees?
So first, and that helps me also address the question, the Palestinian refugee issue is the most important symbolic issue because it represents the continuation of the war of 1948. But in practice, it's a non-issue, because 80% of those who are called refugees are either citizens of Jordan or they live in the West Bank and Gaza. So they don't need to go anywhere. They're already where they are. Many of them are middle class. They don't live in the refugee compounds. I mean, so they don't need to go anywhere. And then the small number are still in Syria and Lebanon. Most of them are left. It's a small number that needs to get either passport or citizenship, but that's it. It's a small issue in practice. It's a large issue symbolically. Now, why does Jordan not want them? Because Jordan was, by the way, the one country that after 1948 gave citizenship to the Arab refugees, declared that it didn't want to give them return, and wanted to sign a peace agreement with Israel based on its annexation of the West Bank. But then a Palestinian murdered King Abdallah, assassinated him, among other things, because of that. And the Jordanians are very touchy. As you know, the Palestinians have been a major destabilizing force for the Hashemite kingdom. They threw them out in September 1970. They disconnected their claim to the West Bank in 1988. They know that accepting Palestinians will destabilize the regime. So that's they want the Palestinians to destabilize Israel, not to destabilize them.
Mm-hmm. Can I just jump in there, because the same question arises for Egypt. Why is Egypt not helping the people of Gaza? I mean, they occupied and held Gaza for 19 years. Why is the UN not pushing Egypt to play more of a significant role?
I think, well,
yeah.
I think that's maybe because they definitely do not like Hamas. Hamas is a part of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is, I think, illegal in Egypt. The present regime came into power after they brought an end to the Muslim Brotherhood regime of the previous president. So I think they don't like Hamas whatsoever, and they don't want to bring them to Egypt, and in order to create turmoil there and to as maybe a threat to the present regime, which is, relatively speaking, on speaking terms and with Israel and respecting the peace treaty they concluded in 1979. And so I think that is the background, at least the background of the fact that Egypt is not very much willing to accept many people from the Gaza Strip.
Yep. Okay, Sylvia, back to you.
Yeah, we have many interesting questions coming in. One about the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, there are quite a lot of Palestinians as well. Is it because of their refugee status that they could come and live here? Could it be they came from Syria, and what makes their status as Palestinian refugee kind of misleading, as they fled from the violence of Assad and never had anything to fear from Israel at all?
So
sorry.
Okay. The Syria situation is actually really fascinating because within Syria, you had Palestinians who were basically Syrian-born Arabs. There's no ethnic difference between the Syrians and the Palestinians, but they were born in Syria. Syria refused to give them citizenship. And then they were registered by UNRWA as refugees from Palestine, but then they became refugees from Syria. And in Holland, you can talk about that, but Holland gave them status based on them being refugees from Syria, but they are still on UNRWA's books as refugees from Palestine. So they may actually have Dutch citizenship, which under any normal rule means that you're no longer a refugee. Yeah. But because the idea of Palestinian refugeehood is a symbolic idea, it's not about real conditions, they are both Dutch citizens who are no longer refugees from Syria, but still retain the symbolic registration as refugees from Palestine.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yep. Sylvia.
Okay. Israel, it has been observed, has no good choices. What is the choice that is the least bad?
Oh.
Look, I can't convey to you. I have discussions with people today, every day. Today in our frustration, Elon Musk was in Israel, I think yesterday or today. And in my frustration, I said, we should actually talk to him about maybe getting people to move to the moon, but because at this point, it's probably the only practical idea we have left. People are coming up with crazy ideas left and right, and all ideas are bad. And all ideas have drawbacks, and all ideas are basically impractical. The one that I favor is the one that I compare the Americans in Japan, the denazification, the de-radicalization of some of the ISIS people, basically a process that makes it clear that a certain ideology is no longer acceptable. The reason that I prefer that choice, as difficult as it is that it is the most humane. Nobody goes, there's no more war. It's just people need to have different ideas. That's all.
Can I just ask, just following on from that, Dr. Wilf, to what extent do you think, we're often presented with the idea you have Hamas and you have the civilians of the Gaza Strip, right? I mean, these are can you really distinguish between Hamas and the ideology of Hamas and the way people of Gaza think? What's the realistic idea? What is the realistic possibility that you can destroy Hamas and then move on to a new future with the people of Gaza?
There's no difference ideologically. One of the reasons that I think it's really dangerous that people want to go with the cliche of the Hamas doesn't represent the Palestinians, even though we see how much support they have after October 7th. And by the way, the reason that Hamas invested so much in this operation, in this attack, is because they knew it would be supported by their people. But if we continue to tell the story that Hamas doesn't represent Palestinians, we will fall exactly into the trap that you highlighted of not dealing with the foundational ideology that created the problem in the first place. So we need to stop telling ourselves that fairy tale. Yes, most Palestinians in Gaza are not trained murderers. They didn't spend the last few years becoming trained murderers. But in terms of the ideology, they absolutely support the ideology of no Jewish state from the river to the sea. And that ideology has to go if we want to make sure that no new organization ever rises to replace Hamas.
If the US attacked another country, we would not say the army attacked or the Democrats attacked. So is it appropriate to say that Gaza or the Palestinians attacked or initiated this war rather than Hamas?
Yeah, like I said before, I think people are conveniently trying to separate Hamas from the Palestinians because they just don't want to do the hard work of undoing the ideology. It's much easier to say, okay, let's just defeat Hamas, but other than that, everything is hunky-dory. And I think it's really dangerous because ultimately we pay the price for it. I think this is the moment where we need to face some hard truth. And one of the hardest truths is that Hamas accurately represents the Palestinian ethos that the Jews should not have their state anywhere between the river and the sea. And if the Palestinians are ever to have a different future, and of course, if the Israelis are ever to have a different future, that destructive ideology, which has brought us nothing but war and displacement and bloodshed and misery, that ideology has to go.
Thank you. Dr. Blois, you have a final parting message for us?
Oh, yes. Well, I think I agree indeed it is difficult to make a distinction between the Hamas ideology and the Palestinian people as such. Although we have seen in the past few weeks some people saying before the cameras that I remember a man saying, well, he blamed Hamas for bringing all this bloodshed and the misery to the Gaza Strip, but that maybe he was the exception. But I think, yes, but changing an ideology is not that easy. Of course, we have seen it in the Second World War in the Nazi Germany. Yes, indeed. I think in also the Nazi regime was supported by many people in Germany. You can't say it was just a very small group.
Yeah.
But indeed, they succeeded in eventually, parting with this whole Nazi ideology. It is only a very small, I hope it still remains a very small minority, and the Germany is taking this very serious. Also in these days, we see pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas demonstrations are prohibited in Germany. They are allowed in the Netherlands, but they are prohibited in Germany, and they take all kinds of measures to make sure that the Jewish citizens of Germany are protected.
Yeah.
So, well, maybe there is a possibility also to bring a change to the Hamas ideology that involves a change of the education system supported by UNRWA and all kinds of things. Of course, there are some contacts, some things in practice also in Judea, Samaria, West Bank, where you see that there are contacts between Jewish people and Palestinian or Arab people living together and helping each other, etc., etc. So maybe there is some hope, but I'm not that optimistic. And of course, the international community in the UN should also change its approach and no longer support Hamas, its ideology, Palestinian ideology, and going back to the rights also guaranteed to the people of Israel, the Jewish people, under international law, in the mandate and via the Charter of the UN. There are good legal arguments to return to a balanced approach by the UN.
Well, I want to thank both of you so very much. This has been extremely informative, I think, and you've shed a lot of light onto this situation. I think to summarize, a lot of challenges ahead. International law, the topic, really the theme of Thinc's work. I think, reaches its limits when it comes to this conflict. We've seen, I think, the conflict on the ground has got a long way to go before, even if to defeat Hamas, let alone finding some long-term solution to the Gaza Strip. This is putting aside the West Bank, Lebanon, so many other fronts that Israel is fighting on. This conflict could go in a lot of different directions from here. But I do think it's important to emphasize that, there is a kind of still an institutional situation created within the United Nations. We have proceedings before the International Court of Justice. We have the International Criminal Court, which has a mandate to prosecute war crimes in the situation in what it calls the situation in the state of Palestine. That includes the Gaza Strip. And the paradigm that they work within is that the Palestinians have a right to a state, and Israel is occupying these territories. There's a big chance that the Court of Justice is going to come down with an advisory opinion which says that the occupation has itself become illegal. And if that's the case, that changes, I think, in a way, at least the legal infrastructure within which this whole discussion is going to have to take place. So I think there's a lot to talk about going forward about the UN. I do want to thank you both very much, Dr. Wilf and Dr. de Blois, for helping us all understand these issues. Thank you for attending wherever you might be. I look forward to seeing you again at the next Thinc webinar on the 12th of December. We're going to talk about the two-state solution. The United States is pushing very hard. It says the only way forward is a two-state solution. How realistic is that? What is the two-state solution? We're going to talk about our recent report on the European approach to the two-state solution. So we look forward to seeing you then. Please keep an eye on our website, think-israel.org, and follow our work, share with others. We do need to expand our audience and involve other people in this conversation. Feel free to make a donation to support the work of Thinc. We're entirely dependent upon donations of people like yourselves to generate information, discussion, which is enlightened, which is truth-based, and which is going to contribute to a positive resolution of peace and security in the Middle East. Thank you so much, and God bless. Look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.